Today we're going to discuss why the Great Depression began, what were some contributing factors, and really what it meant for the United States. We're specifically going to focus on the nation's sick economy and why it became so sick after such a prosperous era of the 1920s. First off, there was a few key industries that were in trouble. Railroads, textiles, steel were barely making a profit. Mining and lumbering expanded during the war, but now they're a lacking demand. Remember, World War I had only been about 12 years before this. It had ended, less than 12 years actually. And so there was a greater demand shortly after World War I because a lot of Europe is in ruins. Now that Europe has started to rebuild a little bit, there's a little bit less demands for American goods. Coal was especially hard hit due to the availability of new energy sources. Things like fuels and hydroelectric power and natural gas. Um, as far as the railroads and industries go, the railroads were starting to hurt because more people had automobiles in the 1920s, so they were hurting as well. So these booming industries start to go down. When you think about housing declining, when people were building less houses, there was less construction, which meant less construction jobs available and things like that. Uh, for the farmers, there had been a great demand during World War I for a lot of the agricultural goods, but prices dropped for about 40%. This is going to have a terrible effect on farmers because farmers think that the solution is to tear up more land and make more products, but the more and more that they have, the farther and farther that the prices drop, which cause a huge problem for a lot of the farmers. So people are going to buy less due to the rising prices and stagnant wages and credit debts overall throughout the American economy as well. People are living on credit. What that means is they buy now, pay later. Think of a credit card. If you have a credit card, you can go to the mall and buy $3,000 worth of goods. You might not have $3,000, but you've just bought $3,000 worth of goods. Say you buy a really expensive watch, a $3,000 watch. Well, somebody from the outside might say, wow, that person might be rich because they have a $3,000 watch. Well, you might have purchased that $3,000 watch, but you don't have that money or the means to buy that $3,000 watch. And when at the end of the month, when that bill comes and you have to pay that $3,000 back, it causes a pretty big problem because you're not going to have that money. So a lot of the prosperity that was going on in the 1920s was pretty superficial. Overall, there was an uneven distribution of income. The poor were getting poorer. About 70% of families earned less than the minimum for a decent standard of living. So even though the American government advertised that was a highest average living in the United States compared to the rest of the world, it was a problem because a lot of that was superficial. Alfred E. Smith was the four-time governor of New York who ran against Hoover in 1928 and lost the election. Um, at the end of the 1920s, the stock market that had been booming throughout the 1920s started to fade away. The Dow Jones is a way to track the stock market. It's kind of like looking at the stock market's grade point average. If it goes up a few points, that's a good thing. If it goes down a few points, it's a bad thing. Well, the stock prices, they had steadily risen. They had risen throughout the 1920s, but people were in a rush to buy the stocks and bonds. But a lot of the people were buying it with borrowed money. This is speculation. They were putting money in, um, buying on margin, paying a small percentage of the price, and borrowing the rest. And then, as far as speculation goes, as soon as they made a quick profit, they'd take their money out. Well, I always compare the stock market kind of like a hot air balloon. Okay, it needs hot air in order to fly, right? But just like the stock market, it needs money. People put in that money and then take it out. It's only going to be doing well for a limited time, just like a hot air balloon. If you put in hot air, then take it out, it's not going to go very high or at least remain in flight for very long. So that's going to cause a number of problems. Eventually, this bubble burst in September. 1929, stock prices kind of peaked. And October 29th, what we refer to as Black Tuesday, was the largest decline in stock value to that time period, even today, though. Others, even if people had not put money on the stock market, many people lost their savings because they would give their money to the banks, invest in the banks. Banks would then give it to investors who would take out these loans. Those investors, those people who played the stock market, would put that money into stock. And when they lost their money on the stock market, they had no money to pay back to the banks. And then the banks could not give that money back to the people. And so many people lost their savings, even if they didn't put money into the stock market. The time period that's going to follow is the Great Depression. After the crash, people started to panic and people withdrew money from their banks. We're going to see a significant number of banks start to close. And by 1929 to 1932, there was 90,000 banks, businesses start to go bankrupt. By 1933, about a fourth of people were jobless. So unemployment had reached 25%. One thing that had hurt the economy was the Hawley-Smoot tariff. What we started to do is we started to see competition from other countries, and to prevent that competition, we then raised tariffs. When we raised those tariffs, a tariff is a tax. Let's take, for example, Canada. If we put a tax on Canada and they could no longer bring their goods over to us, that would help businesses in America because then we have less competition. On the other hand, if we're not able to trade with Canada, Canada's not getting any money and they're not able to buy American goods. So although it meant well, it had a negative effect. Overall, the causes of the Great Depression, we see tariffs, war debts, problems with farms, easy credit. There's a huge gap in the income between different groups, and all these things are going to lead to a pretty long era of troubles that will continue with the Great Depression. So, next time we're going to learn about the hardship and suffering during the Great Depression, but that's all for now.